the 17th of January 1941, Burbank, California. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. The morning sun cuts through the industrial haze hanging over the San Fernando Valley. Inside Hangar 7, a foreman named Harold Whitmore stands before a half-assembled P-38 Lightning fighter, its twin booms skeletal and incomplete. The air smells of machine oil and acetylene. His clipboard trembles slightly in his hands, not from cold, but from the weight of the numbers written there. 73 airframes behind schedule. The aluminum hasn't arrived. Again. Behind him, riveting hammers fall silent one by one as workers realize there's nothing left to rivet. The smooth, silvery sheets that should be stacked floor to ceiling along the hangar's western wall are absent. In their place, empty wooden pallets and the hollow echo of an aviation industry gasping for breath. Whitmore runs his thumb across the edge of an existing aluminum panel, feeling its lightness, its strength, its absolute irreplaceability. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackles with news from Europe. The Luftwaffe has launched another night raid over London. The irony is suffocating. America, the nation that invented mass production, that built an automotive empire on assembly lines and industrial might, cannot build enough warplanes, not because of engineering failures or lack of skill, because of a metal. This is not a story about battlefields or grand strategy. This is a story about absence, about the invisible crisis that nearly crippled American air power before it could even take flight, and about the desperate, ingenious campaign that transformed housewives and schoolchildren into the unsung architects of Allied air supremacy. In 1941, the United States faced a contradiction that bordered on the absurd. It possessed the world's largest industrial base, the most advanced manufacturing techniques, and a workforce eager to contribute to national defense. Yet it could not produce aluminum in quantities sufficient to meet the skyrocketing demands of aircraft production. The deficit was staggering, almost incomprehensible. By December of that year, military planners estimated that America needed to produce at least 60,000 combat aircraft to match Axis air forces and supply Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Each B-17 Flying Fortress required approximately 15,000 pounds of aluminum. Each P-40 Warhawk demanded 4,000. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. The root of the shortage lay not in a lack of bauxite ore, the raw material from which aluminum is refined, but in the electrical infrastructure required to smelt it. Aluminum production is extraordinarily energy-intensive. Refining a single ton of aluminum demands approximately 15,000 kilowatt-hours of electricity, enough to power an average American home for more than a year. In 1940, the United States had only a handful of aluminum smelters, most clustered near hydroelectric dams in the Pacific Northwest and the Tennessee Valley. Expanding this capacity required massive capital investment and years of construction time. The Axis powers, meanwhile, were not waiting. Every month of delay represented hundreds of aircraft that would never reach operational squadrons, hundreds of pilots who would fly into combat outnumbered, hundreds of bombing missions that could not be flown. Military officials understood the mathematics of desperation. In September 1940, the War Department projected aluminum requirements at £1.2 billion for 1,942 alone. Domestic production capacity stood at barely £600 million. Even with aggressive expansion plans, the gap would persist well into 1,943. General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, put it bluntly in a classified memo. "We are attempting to build an air force with one hand tied behind our back. The aluminum shortage is not a bottleneck, it is a tourniquet." The Germans, by contrast, had prepared. Throughout the 1,932nd, the Nazi regime had invested heavily in aluminum production as part of its rearmament program. By 1939, Germany's annual aluminum output exceeded £350 million, supported by captured Austrian refineries and access to Scandinavian hydroelectric power. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, rolled off assembly lines in Augsburg and Regensburg at a rate of more than 300 per month. German pilots, accustomed to material superiority, expected their industrial base to maintain this advantage indefinitely. Aluminum was simply another resource to be exploited, another element of the Reich's self-proclaimed invincibility. American military planners expected similar confidence, similar abundance. They expected to leverage the nation's industrial genius to turn factories from automobiles to aircraft as smoothly as retooling a production line. Instead, they found themselves staring at empty warehouses and unfulfilled contracts. The expectation was dominance. The reality was scarcity. It was into this crisis that an unlikely solution emerged, not from government laboratories or military research facilities, but from the basements and backyards of ordinary Americans. The idea was simultaneously simple and revolutionary. If new aluminum could not be produced quickly enough, then old aluminum would have to be reclaimed. Recycling was not a new concept in 1941, but its application on an industrial scale, mobilized as a matter of national survival, was unprecedented. The campaign began quietly. In June 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, the Office of Production Management, predecessor to the War Production Board, launched an experimental scrap aluminum drive in several East Coast cities. The initial response was modest. Citizens donated old pots, bent tire rims, broken lawn furniture. The collected material was measured in tons, but the psychological impact was measured in something else entirely. The realization that civilians possessed agency in a conflict that still felt distant and abstract. Then came the 7th of December, 1941. Pearl Harbor transformed American consciousness overnight. Suddenly, the war was no longer something happening to other people in faraway places. It was immediate, personal, existential. Within weeks, scrap metal drives exploded across the nation with evangelical fervor. But aluminum, lightweight, non-magnetic, often overlooked, required special attention and education. The Women's Division of the War Production Board took the lead. Organizers fanned out across cities, towns, and rural communities, armed with pamphlets, posters, and a message that connected the mundane to the momentous. "That old coffee pot can become a P-40 fighter," one poster declared, showing a housewife holding a battered percolator in one hand and a silhouette of a war hawk in the other. Another depicted a stack of aluminum pie plates morphing into the wing of a bomber, the caption reading, "Your kitchen is a munitions factory." The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. In a society where women's domestic labor was often invisible and undervalued, the scrap aluminum campaign rendered it vital. A pot was no longer just a pot. It was raw material for a propeller blade, a section of fuselage skin, a structural rib in a vertical stabilizer. The private sphere became public. The personal became strategic. Schools organized competitions. In Milwaukee, a fifth-grade class collected 700 pounds of aluminum in a single week, enough, according to enthusiastic War Department calculations, to build the cockpit framing for 2 fighter aircraft. The students' names were printed in the local newspaper beneath a headline that read, "Young Patriots Forge Wings of Victory." In rural Kansas, a farmer named Ernest Caldwell hauled a rusted aluminum irrigation pipe to a collection depot, joking grimly that he was sending Hitler a message via airmail. The pipe weighed 84 pounds, enough for 20 artillery shell fuses, or half of an aircraft landing gear assembly. Civic organizations competed with each other. The Rotary Club in Omaha challenged the Kiwanis Club to see who could collect more aluminum in a month. The prize: a certificate and the knowledge that their efforts might, in some infinitesimal but real way, shorten the war by a day, an hour, a minute. Boy Scout troops went door to door, politely asking for aluminum donations and providing receipts stamped with patriotic imagery. One troop in Ohio collected an old aluminum canoe, which was photographed, publicized, and ceremonially delivered to a local scrap depot. The image of scouts paddling a canoe down Main Street, destined for a smelter rather than a lake, became a minor propaganda sensation. But beneath the enthusiastic rhetoric and cheerful posters, the logistical reality was staggering. Aluminum recycling in 1941 was not a simple matter of melting down pots and pouring them into molds. Household aluminum was alloyed with various elements, magnesium, manganese, silicon, that made it unsuitable for direct use in aircraft. The collected scrap had to be sorted, cleaned, analyzed, and reprocessed. Impurities had to be removed. Alloys had to be adjusted. The infrastructure to accomplish this on a massive scale did not exist in June 1941. It had to be built, calibrated, and scaled up while the collection drives were already underway. The Reynolds Metals Company, a secondary smelter based in Louisville, Kentucky, retooled its facilities to handle civilian scrap. Engineers developed processes to separate different aluminum alloys by analyzing melt temperatures and chemical signatures. What had been a niche industrial operation became a critical node in the war economy. By mid-1942, Reynolds was processing more than 5 million pounds of scrap aluminum per month, transforming bent fenders and discarded cookware into ingots that met military specifications. Alcoa, the nation's largest primary aluminum producer, established secondary refining facilities adjacent to its main smelters. Trainloads of compressed scrap aluminum arrived daily, baled and bundled like metallic hay. Workers fed the material into massive furnaces where it was melted, refined, and cast into standardized billets. These billets were then shipped to aircraft manufacturers, Lockheed, Boeing, Douglas, Consolidated, where they were rolled into sheets, extruded into tubing, or machined into components. The efficiency of the system was imperfect, but its scale was breathtaking. Government records indicate that between January 1942 and December 1943, American civilians donated approximately 360 million pounds of scrap aluminum. Not all of it was usable. Contamination rates ran as high as 30% in some batches, but even accounting for losses, the recycled aluminum provided enough material to build components for an estimated 18,000 aircraft, roughly equivalent to the entire Luftwaffe's operational strength, in the summer of 1943. The symbolic coffee pot was, in fact, becoming a fighter plane, and with it, American ideology was being forged in furnaces alongside aluminum ingots. German soldiers, when they first encountered American aircraft in significant numbers during the North African campaign in late 1942, expected machines built by a nation they had been taught to dismiss as soft, decadent, materialistic. Nazi propaganda had long portrayed America as a mongrel nation, lacking the discipline and unity of purpose that characterized the Third Reich. German pilots anticipated American fighters to be adequately built, perhaps, but nothing exceptional, certainly not superior to the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters that had dominated European skies for 3 years. What they encountered instead was a revelation that shook assumptions to their foundations. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, climbed faster and flew higher than anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, brutish fighter, absorbed punishment that would have shredded a Bf-109 and kept flying. And the P-51 Mustang, once fitted with British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, possessed a range that allowed it to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back something German military theorists had declared aerodynamically impossible. But it was not just the performance that unsettled German airmen. It was the sheer, incomprehensible abundance. In the spring of 1943, a Luftwaffe pilot named Klaus Mietusch, an ace with more than 30 kills, was shot down over Tunisia and captured by American forces. During his interrogation, he was shown photographs of American aircraft factories, Douglas in Long Beach, Boeing in Seattle, Consolidated in Fort Worth. The images depicted assembly lines stretching hundreds of yards, bombers in various stages of construction lined up wingtip to wingtip, hangars filled with completed aircraft waiting for delivery. Mietusch, according to the intelligence officer's notes, stared at the photographs in silence for several minutes. Then he asked, in careful English, "How many factories like this do you have?" When told that these were only 3 of more than a dozen major aircraft production facilities, his face, the officer noted, registered something between disbelief and despair. The aluminum, some tiny fraction of which had come from a housewife's kitchen in Iowa or a farmer's shed in Georgia, had been transformed not just into aircraft, but into a psychological weapon. Every fighter that appeared over the battlefield was a testament to a system that German ideology insisted should not work a democracy, chaotic and individualistic, mobilizing millions of people not through compulsion but through collective will. Japanese soldiers and airmen experienced a parallel disillusionment. In the early months of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces dominated the skies. The Zero fighter, lightweight and maneuverable, outperformed every Allied aircraft it encountered. Japanese pilots, trained extensively and imbued with Bushido warrior ethos, expected their material and spiritual superiority to carry them to inevitable victory. By mid-1943, that certainty had curdled into grim attrition. American factories were producing aircraft at rates that Japanese intelligence officers initially dismissed as propaganda fabrications. Surely, they reasoned, no nation could build 15,000 fighters in a single year. It was industrially implausible, economically unsustainable. Yet the aircraft kept appearing over Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, over the Philippines, and they were not inferior machines flown by desperate pilots. They were Corsairs and Hellcats, rugged and powerful, flown by increasingly skilled aviators who seemed to multiply with every passing month. A captured Japanese document, translated by American intelligence in late 1944, contained a revealing passage. It was a training manual for new pilots, attempting to prepare them psychologically for what they would face. "The enemy's material resources appear infinite," it stated. "Do not expect numerical parity. Do not expect replacement aircraft to match losses. Expect only that your skill and spirit must compensate for the disparity in machines." The manual did not mention aluminum. It did not need to. The disparity it described was forged, in part, from the accumulated scrap of a continent-old pipes and broken tools, dented pans and obsolete machinery, melted down and reborn as instruments of war. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was not a weapon or a piece of equipment. It was the humble aluminum ingot, a trapezoidal block of refined metal, stamped with alloy codes and weight specifications. In scrap collection depots across America, stacks of these ingots became physical manifestations of civilian contribution. Newsreels showed them being loaded onto rail cars, destined for aircraft plants. Propaganda posters depicted a giant ingot with wings soaring toward victory. But the ingot also represented something more subtle and profound: the democratization of warfare. Throughout history, arms and armor had been the province of elites, those who could afford swords, horses, cannons, warships. The common person's role was to labor in fields or factories, generating the wealth that professional soldiers would expend. The scrap aluminum campaign inverted that relationship. The housewife, the farmer, the schoolchild became, in a very literal sense, armament producers. Their old coffee pot, melted and refined, might become the skin of a wing that carried a bomber over the Ruhr Valley. Their discarded gutters might be recast into the frame of a fighter that shot down a Zero over the Pacific. This democratization extended beyond mere symbolism. The War Production Board meticulously tracked scrap aluminum contributions by region, publishing statistics that newspapers reprinted with civic pride. Indiana collected £12 million in 1942. Ohio collected 15 million. California, with its concentration of aircraft plants, collected 22 million. These were not abstract numbers. They translated directly into aircraft components, into operational capability, into lives saved and missions accomplished. Factory workers at Boeing's Seattle plant were shown photographs of scrap collection drives in rural Montana. The message was explicit. The people in those photographs were their partners, Their collaborators in a shared endeavor. The distance between a farmhouse in Montana and an assembly line in Seattle collapsed. Both were points on the same production network, linked by metal and purpose. German workers, by contrast, labored under a system that treated them as interchangeable cogs in a vast machine. Aluminum production in the Third Reich was centralized, militarized, coerced. Slave laborers from occupied territories were worked to death in refineries and smelters. There was no appeal to civic pride, no celebration of individual contribution. There was only quotas and punishment for failure to meet them. When Allied bombers began systematically targeting German aluminum facilities in 1943, the Erftwerk refinery near Cologne, the plants at Bitterfeld and Lauter, the losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Germany had no reserve of scrap aluminum to fall back on, no civilian mobilization to compensate. The production lines slowed, then stalled. By 1944, Messerschmitt was manufacturing fighters with wooden tail sections and steel components, substituting heavier, inferior materials because aluminum had become too scarce. Japanese aluminum production faced similar collapse. Dependent on bauxite imports from Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, Japan's supply lines were severed by American submarines and air attacks. By 1945, Japanese aircraft factories were cannibalizing wrecked planes for aluminum, melting down components from destroyed fighters to build new ones. It was a closed loop of diminishing returns, a spiral of scarcity that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. American aluminum production, meanwhile, continued to expand. New smelters came online in 1943 and 1944, powered by hydroelectric dams built specifically to support them. But the scrap drives continued as well, not because the material was still desperately needed, but because the ritual had become embedded in national identity. To collect aluminum was to participate in the war effort, to claim a stake in the outcome. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, Harold Whitmore, the foreman who had stood before an empty aluminum rack in January 1941, walked through the same Lockheed hangar. It was barely recognizable. The floor was crowded with completed P-38 seconds, their aluminum skins gleaming under overhead lights, waiting for ferry pilots to fly them to embarkation points. The stacks of aluminum along the western wall rose 12 feet high, sheet after sheet of precise alloy, stamped and ready for use. Whitmore ran his hand across one of the sheets, the same gesture he had made 4 years earlier, but now the texture was different. This aluminum was smooth, unblemished, fresh from the refinery. But he knew because War Production Board pamphlets had told him, because newsreels had shown him, because the entire nation had been educated in the alchemy of recycling that somewhere in this metal, mixed and blended at the molecular level, were atoms that had once been part of a pot, a pipe, a pie plate. Somewhere in this sheet was a fragment of the collective will that had transformed scarcity into abundance. Documented records from the War Production Board, declassified decades later, reveal the final accounting. Between 1942 and 1945, civilian scrap aluminum contributions totaled approximately £450 million. Combined with expanded primary production, the United States produced more than £5.6 billion of aluminum during the war years, enough to build over 300,000 aircraft, more than all other combatant nations combined. The numbers are staggering, but they obscure the transformation that occurred within them. German and Japanese military planners had expected American industrial power, certainly. What they had not expected was the fusion of that industrial base, with a population mobilized not through fear or coercion, but through participation and shared purpose. The aluminum did not just build aircraft. It built a collective identity, a narrative in which every citizen could claim authorship. Historian David M. Kennedy, in his comprehensive study of American wartime mobilization, observed that the scrap drives aluminum, rubber, steel, functioned as rituals of inclusion, transforming the home front into an extension of the battlefield. The kitchen became an armory. The backyard became a supply depot. The boundary between civilian and combatant blurred until it was nearly invisible. This blurring terrified Axis strategists who grasped its implications. A war fought by professional soldiers can be won by destroying those soldiers or breaking their will. A war fought by an entire population, where grandmothers and school children are materially invested in the outcome, has no clear, vulnerable point. There is no morale to break when morale is distributed across 100 million people, each convinced that their coffee pot or scrap pipe is flying over Berlin. In the final months of the war, American engineers began surveying German and Japanese aluminum facilities, cataloguing the ruins of an industrial base that had been ground to dust. The reports make for grim reading. The Erftwerk refinery was a moonscape of craters and twisted steel. The Japanese plant at Omachi, once capable of producing 30 million pounds of aluminum per year, was a burned shell, its furnaces cold, its roof collapsed. But it was not just the physical destruction that shocked the survey teams. It was the absence of infrastructure for recycling, the lack of any system to reclaim scrap. German facilities had been designed for a short, victorious war, optimized for maximum output with no thought to sustainability or adaptation. When the war dragged on and Allied bombing disrupted supply chains, the system had no resilience, no capacity to regenerate. One American engineer, in a report filed from the ruined Lauter refinery in eastern Germany, wrote, "It is evident that the enemy's aluminum production was a brittle instrument, rigid and fragile. Our own system, by contrast, possessed a flexibility born of necessity and sustained by civilian participation. We could absorb losses and adapt. They could not." The flexibility he described was not accidental. It was the product of a specific ideology, one that valued decentralization, improvisation, and the aggregation of small contributions into collective strength. The scrap aluminum campaign embodied these values in metal form. It was democracy, rendered tangible and strategic. The P-38 Lightning that Harold Whitmore watched roll off the assembly line in May 1945 never saw combat. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. The aircraft was flown to a storage facility in Arizona, where it sat in the desert sun alongside thousands of others, waiting for a conflict that would never come. Years later, it was scrapped, its aluminum recycled once again, perhaps into automobile bodies or household siding, returning to the civilian economy from which it had originally come. But the legacy of that aircraft, and the tens of thousands like it, extended far beyond their operational lifespan. They represented a principle that had been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable, that a free society, given purpose and agency, could outproduce, outbuild, and outlast any totalitarian system, no matter how regimented or ruthless. The German soldier who had expected American softness found instead an industrial juggernaut powered by democratic participation. The Japanese pilot, who had expected spiritual superiority to overcome material disadvantage, discovered that his opponents possessed both material abundance and the moral conviction that came from knowing their cause was just and their contributions mattered. The coffee pot, melted down and reborn as part of a fighter's wing, became a kind of sacred object in American wartime mythology, not because it was inherently valuable, but because it symbolized transformation. Base metal into instrument of liberation, private property into public good, individual sacrifice into collective strength. In the decades after the war, as the urgency faded and the scrap drives became distant memory, historians and economists debated the actual material impact of civilian aluminum recycling. Some argued that the contributions, while symbolically important, were statistically minor compared to expanded primary production. Others countered that the psychological impact justified the effort, that the sense of participation sustained morale during dark years when victory seemed uncertain. But these debates, however scholarly, miss the essential truth. The scrap aluminum campaign worked not because of the metal it collected, though that metal was real and useful. It worked because it taught an entire nation that they were not spectators to history but participants in it. It worked because it created a feedback loop of contribution and recognition, where even the smallest donation was publicly acknowledged as vital. When Harold Whitmore touched that aluminum sheet in 1945, he was touching more than refined metal. He was touching the accumulated will of millions of people who had decided that their old pots and pipes were worth less than the freedom those objects could help secure. He was touching the physical manifestation of a choice to give rather than hoard, to participate rather than withdraw, to believe that individual actions, multiplied across a nation, could shape the outcome of a global conflict. The Germans had expected a nation too divided and decadent to fight effectively. The Japanese had expected a people too individualistic and materialistic to endure hardship. Both discovered that they had mistaken democracy for weakness and abundance for softness. The aluminum, some of it forged from the very symbols of American domesticity and prosperity, became the medium through which those misconceptions were violently corrected. There is a photograph, taken in the summer of 1943, that captures this transformation with almost unbearable clarity. It shows a woman in her 70s standing beside a scrap aluminum collection bin in a small Iowa town. She is holding an aluminum pot, worn and dented, clearly used for decades. Her expression is solemn, almost ceremonial. Behind her, a poster reads, "This pot can win the war." The image was used in newsreels and magazines, reproduced millions of times as propaganda. But stripped of its context, removed from the urgency of wartime, the photograph reveals something deeper. The woman is not surrendering something. She is investing it. She is taking an object of purely personal utility and transforming it into something with strategic, even historic, significance. In that gesture, hand extended, pot held out like an offering, is encapsulated the entire logic of democratic mobilization. The pot did not win the war. No single pot, no single ingot, no single aircraft could make that claim. But the pot, and millions of objects like it, created the material conditions that made victory possible. They filled the gap between aspiration and capability, between what America wanted to achieve and what it had the resources to accomplish. And in doing so, they became more than metal. They became a parable about the nature of freedom, that it is not passive or abstract, that it requires participation and sacrifice, that its defense is not the responsibility of soldiers alone, but of everyone who benefits from it. The aluminum, forged from scrap and shaped into wings, carried that parable across oceans and continents, delivering it to the Axis powers with explosive force. The coffee pot became a fighter plane. The fighter plane became a message, and the message, etched in aluminum and written in the contrails above a burning Berlin, read, "We are not what you thought we were. We are stronger because we are free. And our strength comes not from the top down, but from the bottom up, from the ordinary people you dismissed and underestimated, from the coffee pots and pie plates they donated, from the will they collectively embodied." That message did not end the war on its own, but it made the ending inevitable. And in the furnaces where scrap aluminum melted and reformed, where old domestic objects became instruments of liberation, a new understanding was being forged that the true arsenal of democracy was not its factories or its resources, but its people, and their capacity to transform scarcity into abundance through shared effort and collective will. Harold Whitmore understood this as he stood in that hangar, surrounded by gleaming aircraft, in the spring of 1945. The empty racks of 1941 had been filled not just by increased production, but by a nation that had learned to see strategic value in everyday objects, and to recognize that their own contributions, however small, were threads in a tapestry of victory. The aluminum gleamed under the hangar lights, smooth and perfect, ready to fly. And somewhere within its molecular structure, invisible but present, were atoms from 1,000 towns, 1,000,000 homes, fragments of a society that had chosen to melt down its comforts and forge them into wings. That choice, more than any single battle or campaign, defined the character of American victory. It was not imposed from above. It was built from below, one coffee pot at a time, one ingot at a time, one aircraft at a time, until the sky itself belonged to those who understood that freedom, like aluminum, must be refined through fire and reshaped through collective effort. And when the last bomber returned, and the last fighter was grounded, and the aluminum was recycled once more into peacetime goods, the lesson remained that a democracy, mobilized and united, possessed a kind of industrial alchemy that no totalitarian system could match or replicate. The furnaces cooled. The war ended. But the transformation endured, cast in metal and memory, a permanent testament to what ordinary people could accomplish when they understood that their contributions, however humble, were essential to the survival of freedom itself.